Perhaps the greatest illusion of modern civilization is not what we believe, but how we have learned to see. We built civilizations of extraordinary intelligence, yet somewhere along the way, we forgot how to see the whole. Never before have we understood so many parts, while forgetting how they belong together.
Modern life is defined by a grid of hyper-efficient nodes, yet the social structures holding them together feel increasingly brittle. Rates of chronic isolation are climbing, political discourse has dissolved into tribal hostility, and the speed of extracting natural resources now outpaces the Earth's capacity to regenerate. We attempt to diagnose these issues by reducing living systems into isolated metrics and spreadsheets. It's a rigid way to organize information, like solving advanced calculus using only Roman numerals. It allows us to calculate, but not to understand. This collection of crises reflects a massive failure in our civilizational operating system. To find the source of this failure, we have to look past the subjects we are analyzing and examine the very nature of human attention. 19th century naturalists recognized that environments are deeply woven together. As John Muir observed, whenever we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. When we slice a single element out of its ecosystem to study it in isolation, we strip away the relational context that actually gives that element its meaning and function. Thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this exact trap, observing a steady historical march where pure, isolating rationality gradually cannibalized human instinct and intuition. The fragmentation of our culture is a direct reflection of a biological mechanism inside our own skulls, two competing ways of attending to the world. Popular psychology has spent decades categorizing the left side of the human brain as the logical calculator and the right side as the free-flowing artist. Psychiatric researcher Iain McGilchrist found that both hemispheres are actually involved in almost every cognitive action. The real difference lies entirely in the type of attention each hemisphere pays to the environment. The left hemisphere provides a narrow, highly targeted focus. It dismantles a complex, living reality into discrete, manipulatable parts so that we can grasp and control them. The right hemisphere provides a broad, comprehensive awareness. It prioritizes the whole, absorbing the full context and the living relationships between things. To survive, an animal must utilize both. A bird foraging requires precise, laser-like focus to distinguish a seed from the dirt. But to avoid predators, it must simultaneously maintain a wide, vigilant field of awareness to detect subtle environmental changes. Biological success relies on this parallel harmony, the analytical emissary securing the immediate objective, while the holistic master understands the wider world. This capacity to isolate and extract a single part, the exact tool used by the foraging bird, is the foundation of engineering and mass production. Over the last 2 centuries, our social and economic systems have prioritized this extractive mode of attention over all others. This creates a system of hierarchical dualism, where the isolated object in the center of our attention is assigned all the value, and the surrounding context is completely dismissed as irrelevant margin. Through this lens, ancient forests and complex ecosystems cease to be living communities. They are simply raw materials, measured and optimized for consumption. This same extractive gaze is turned upon us. Human cognitive bandwidth is mined as an exhaustible resource, reducing our behavior to data points and engagement metrics. The analytical emissary has overthrown the master. We have built a civilization that is exceptionally skilled at manipulating the physical world, but deeply alienated from it. Reversing this trajectory requires returning to the right hemisphere's primary mode of perception, recognizing reality not as a collection of parts to be sorted, but as an irreducible living web. This graphic illustrates the biological processes of the Earth as a deeply integrated community. Survival depends on the health of the connections between species, rather than the dominance of a single one. This mirrors indigenous philosophies, like the African concept of Ubuntu, famously embodied by leaders like Nelson Mandela. It operates on a simple premise: a person is a person through other persons. Human flourishing occurs when individual efforts are integrated into communal achievements. Individual survival is indivisibly tied to communal prosperity. The Edenic Truth Institute frames this as a foundational law. Relationship precedes reality. The world we build is a direct consequence of how we choose to pay attention to it. The fragmentation of our ecology and our civic life cannot be repaired by applying more rigid categorizations or by intensifying individual competition. Recovery requires recoherence. It is the natural process of isolated elements yielding their rigid boundaries, flowing back together to form a unified, resilient whole. The next evolutionary step for our species involves a conscious choice to step out of the mechanical worldview and remember how to attend to one another. Look at a standard suburban street. 50 different houses sit on 50 adjacent plots of land, heavily divided by invisible borders and physical fences. Each one operates as a completely sealed-off microkingdom. Inside those borders, you will find 50 lawnmowers sitting idle most of the week. You will find 50 ladders and 50 drills, and 50 identical, rarely used tool sets. Human survival did not evolve this way. For nearly all of our history, we lived in care societies. Communities distributed the energy load. If a village needed to build something, they relied on 4 or 5 high-quality shared tools and communal labor. Risk and resources were spread out. Today, we ask a single household to replicate the entire provisioning capacity of an ancient village. The burden of managing every aspect of survival in total isolation creates a constant, low-level physical burnout and severe emotional dysregulation. We have convinced ourselves that owning everything individually is a marker of success. Instead, it is an exhaustingly expensive evolutionary trap that actively monetizes our isolation. This bar chart scales isolated consumption up to the global population. At our current rate of resource use, if everyone adopted this hyper-individualized Western lifestyle, it would require exactly 3 planets to sustain it. We arrived here through the enclosure of the commons. Time-tested community resources, shared land, water, and tools were aggressively privatized. They were locked behind fences and price tags. This severed the horizontal interpersonal networks that people used to rely on. To survive, these isolated consumer units must now rely entirely on centralized market hierarchies to fulfill their basic needs. We are repeatedly sold this atomization as the ultimate pinnacle of economic efficiency. Yet, the physical reality of this system is a rapidly degrading environment and an utterly exhausted population. Look at the heavyweights of the modern Western economy, the massive institutions driving commercial banking, national taxation, and global insurance. They aggressively promote extreme individualism to consumers, encouraging everyone to carve out their own separate financial fiefdom. But internally, they operate on a completely different logic. Their immense architectural success requires pooling resources, creating collective safety nets, and heavily distributing risk across large populations. An insurance company survives precisely because it acts like a village. The systems extracting the most wealth from isolated individuals rely heavily on the exact same collective mechanics that they prevent the public from accessing. The direct antithesis to this manufactured isolation is embedded in the indigenous African philosophy of Ubuntu. Culturally championed by figures like Nelson Mandela, it translates essentially to, "I am because we are." When an economic model rewards strict self-interest, the natural outputs are resource hoarding, artificial scarcity, and the ruthless exploitation of the natural environment. Communal systems, by contrast, naturally build mutual aid, retain shared cultural memory, and establish deep ecological resilience. The group's survival dictates the individual's success. In a deeply interdependent system, extracting wealth by destroying the local environment or exploiting your neighbor is completely illogical. Harming the community is literal self-harm. Escaping this trap does not require inventing a utopian new economic framework from scratch. The architecture of communal living already exists. We simply need to reclaim it locally. This process is known as revitalizing the local commons. As researchers like Elinor Ostrom proved, cooperative community-based institutions are incredibly effective at governing shared resources, entirely bypassing the need for centralized state control or private ownership. It requires a distinct behavioral shift. We have to step out of the passive spectator mindset of the consumer and step into the active participatory role of authorship. True sustainability relies on building strong Earth democracies. It means designing human enterprise to fit nature, not attempting to redesign nature to fit infinite human wants. The micro-kingdom mentality isolates citizens in expensive silos, leaving them deeply vulnerable to economic shocks and completely ecologically bankrupt. You will never find genuine security or environmental wisdom by hoarding individually owned tools in a privatized bunker. Our ultimate survival as a species relies on a time-tested, radical realization. We deeply need the people next door. You can't morally uplift a person in a system that scripturally debases them. True liberation must be social, and it must be shared.